Thank you for joining us at tonight's Holyoake Lecture, which is one of 5 lectures in the Humanists UK annual lecture series, which also includes the Darwin Day, the Rosalind Franklin, the Voltaire, and the Blackham lectures. Each of these lectures takes their own theme, and collectively they bring together thousands of people each year to look at a different topic from a humanist perspective. But the Holyoake Lecture, tonight's lecture, is a little bit different. It's always our small p political lecture, and there's always going to be a little bit of disagreement. The lecture has hosted diverse, you could say, political speakers, including Owen Jones, Robert Peston, Douglas Murray, Joan Bakewell, Kenan Malik, Laura Schwartz, and Kate Pickett in recent years. And it is named after the 19th century humanist activist, George Jacob Holyoake. Like Holyoake, who among his other achievements coined the word secularism and was a lifelong political and trade union and cooperative activist, he was almost jailed for his humanist beliefs and for his right to speak freely. The Holyoake Lecture itself has been that little bit edgier. It looks at contemporary questions and political ideas and holds them up to scrutiny from you, the audience. Humanists don't agree about everything, don't agree about much, no, we agree about lots. And the fact that we don't agree about everything is a good thing. Now, I won't delay you much longer. After I introduce our speaker, I'll reappear at the end to take questions from the audience. You can start using the Q&A function at any time to submit questions throughout tonight's talk. Our speaker tonight is Zion Lights. Zion is a science communicator who is known for her environmental advocacy work. She is the founder of the evidence-based climate activism group, Emergency Reactor, and is the author of The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting. Zion is also a leading speaker on clean energy, specifically nuclear energy, and lectures on effective science communication, tackling misinformation, and climate action. She's the former editor of the Hourglass, Extinction Rebellion's in-house print newspaper, and was previously the group's spokesperson for 2 years. Tonight, she will ask the question, could we even just stop oil? And we do love a provocative title. So without further ado, Zion Lights.
Okay, so you already know a little bit about me, but I'm going to go over some of my background. So this lecture is titled, Can We Just Stop Oil and How? Now, this is something that I have been thinking about for a long time as someone who has been fighting against fossil fuels. So a little bit about my background for those of you who don't know. I've been involved in the environmental movement for about 20 years. Not including small protests I did against my parents when I was a kid, trying to get them to recycle. And so here we have a couple of different groups I was a member of. About 15 years ago, there was a group called the Camp for Climate Action. It doesn't exist anymore. It was only around for 5 or 6 years, but every year we would engage in direct action, much like Extinction Rebellion, but it wouldn't be it wouldn't involve the public so much. It would be targeting a specific place. So in this picture that you can see at the top, this was protest against a bank that was investing in tar sands. We were against fracking, and we had Indigenous people come over from Alberta where they were being kicked off the land because companies wanted to frack there. And so basically I have been doing this for a long time, and I have been protesting fossil fuels for a long time. Most recently, in the other image with the pink boat, you might recognize that from Extinction Rebellion. I was a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion, and I did found their climate reporting newspaper, which was the first of its kind in the UK at the time. And at the height of its print run, it had 100,000 copies distributed around the UK, which were distributed by volunteers. So I've been very active thinking about these issues for a long time, not just thinking about them, but actually putting myself out there, putting my body on the line sometimes when I was much younger, as you can see in that picture. If you're wondering what's happening in that picture, we dressed up as tar sands monsters, went into the bank to shut it down. We did shut it down, but the reason we're wearing black bean bags is because we were tar sand monsters. It was a theatrical piece. Anyway, then I started doing maybe more sensible things. I wrote this book, which was about lowering your carbon footprint. I wanted to have children, but I wanted to live sustainably, and I wanted to make sure I knew that I was, still maintaining my quite low carbon footprint. I didn't fly, I didn't have a car, never had a car, never been able to drive, never learned to drive. And I made all of these decisions based on the kind of dominant environmental messaging, which has for a long time been that we should live with a low carbon footprint. And I'll get back to this later, but I really have walked the walk on this. I wrote an entire book on it. It was evidence-based, and it's very important for me that it was evidence-based, because when I became pregnant with my first daughter, all the books on green parenting that I could find were anti-vaccination. Some of them were anti-medication, anti-going to doctors, and they'd promote homeopathy. A lot of them were anti-schooling, and I found that there wasn't anything that existed at the time. So I had this conversation with New Internationalist publishers, and they said there is space for a book that's evidence-based. So I went away and I researched all the different ways to live with a low carbon footprint. What should you eat? What should your children eat? How should you, what nappy should you use? And I really delved into this data. So I was very hyper-focused on it, which I would say society has become more so over time. But I changed my mind a little bit on this, and I'll cover that later. Now to the topic of oil. So oil underpins daily life. We are highly dependent on oil at the moment. And it's an interesting thing to discuss, actually, because there are other fossil fuels that are much easier to replace than oil. So it's an interesting sort of dilemma that this poses. And this has come to our attention thanks to a protest group. Many of the members of that group have come from Extinction Rebellion. I knew some of them and worked with some of them. Some of them I knew. And they decided to take that focus from Extinction Rebellion, which was about bringing awareness to the issue and the seriousness of climate change. They decided to narrow that down to one target. We just stop oil. We should do this immediately. And this is what's formed this debate. Now, it's probably quite obvious to you that we're heavily dependent on oil. What's probably not obvious is just how hard it is to get off of oil, just how hard it is to make this transition. And that's what I'm going to cover a little bit of. But this bit is good news. So when I was looking into where we mostly are dependent on oil, actually a lot of it is in transport, and we are already making waves in this area, especially in Britain. Actually, we are making a transition to electric vehicles very quickly. In the world, we're one of the fastest nations doing that, and that is purely because people are making those choices to switch to EVs, and councils are quickly putting in the chargers where they can. We're making that transition very quickly. So that still leaves a fair chunk that's very difficult. I would say probably air travel is the hardest in that area. And that's where people would say, well, actually, then we need to reduce air travel. But in terms of the bulk of this, we kind of have a handle on it. And one of the reasons I diverged with my thinking from these environmental groups that I pretty much grew up in, that was involved in for a long time, is because we never talk about these positive aspects, the things that we are doing well, the things where we are progressing, which is much harder to see, I understand, in the moment than on a wider timescale. But I think actually it's important to remember these things because it's what encourages us and drives us forward, rather than having a kind of doomer narrative and feeling that everything we're doing is wrong or bad. And this is a little bit of a problem that I have with the environmental movement, which, in my mind was not founded on humanist principles. It was founded on actually the overpopulation myth, which was, at the time, there was a book published called The Population Bomb. And the concerns around this were that there would be too many people to feed and there would be widespread famine as a result. This never played out, but it had severe, dire consequences for people around the world, especially in countries like India, where it was this book and the narrative around it was taken so seriously as an environmental concern by the Indian government that they encouraged people to be sterilized. And I wouldn't say forced, because basically what they said to Indian people was that if you wanted a job or you wanted to rent a house, you had to show a certificate showing that you'd been sterilized. So it wasn't quite forced, but millions of people were sterilized because of this myth of population. And that is kind of where the environmental movement grew from. And this, I would argue that idea that people are the problem, people are the ones that are causing the damage, and people are the ones that should suffer for this is wrong, and that it needs challenging. But back to oil. So here's a good case study, because this is really recent. This was only a few weeks ago, announced a few weeks ago, that Lego, the company, big Danish company, Lego, they make these beautiful plastic bricks. We probably all played with them growing up. I certainly did. They've spent years and they've spent millions of pounds trying to replace their bricks so that they don't have to use oil. They've used PET, and this is made from partly from recycled plastic bottles. But they decided to abandon this just a few weeks ago. They decided to abandon this because they basically found that the alternative was more damaging to the environment because it had such high carbon emissions. And I actually think this is a really good example because it shows how challenging it is to replace oil. in even very simple products that we all kind of take for granted. B, they have spent a lot of time and money on this. It's not that people aren't trying. They are absolutely trying at their own cost. They are trying. They spent something like 350 million on this sustainability program, and they still haven't found a solution. And also C, I think some applause is due, because actually what Lego could have done, which some companies do, is replace it anyway and use this PET alternative and claim, hey, we're now oil free, so we're trendy now and we're good, and hide the fact that actually the emissions were worse. So you have to think about this when you think about slogans like Just Stop Oil. Is it virtue signaling, or are you actually making efforts to protect the environment and to bring down carbon emissions, which should be our main sort of thinking around these issues? So this is one of the ways that you can replace oil. You may have heard of this, pyrolysis. Actually, this is a tried and tested technology. I'd say it's underfunded. A lot of people don't know about it. It's energy intensive, so that makes it more expensive. That makes people not want to invest in it. But this is a way of replacing oil at the moment that we could roll out if we really wanted to. If there were people really pushing for this technology. It's just pyrolysis is you heat an organic material without oxygen, and it creates a synthetic fuel, a lot like petroleum. It's as simple as that. It can replace diesel, and what I would say is that it's a shame that there are technological solutions like this that a lot of people haven't heard of, that don't even come into the discussions about what will we replace oil with. It's not about stopping oil per se, it's about replacing it, because it is fundamental to our daily lives, and we do have very high quality of lives, which is an argument you'll hear me make many times if you follow any of my other work, which is that there are two ideas you have to hold in your head about fossil fuels. One is, yes, we burned a lot of fossil fuels, and it did create climate change. It made climate change really bad. We put all this waste into the Earth's atmosphere. We need to deal with that desperately. But two, if we hadn't burned those fossil fuels, we would still be poor. For most of human history, we lived in poverty. Infant mortality rates were horrendous and still are in some parts of the world. But actually, poverty has been reduced around the world, where people have had this access to energy, to electricity, and to development, and access to things that we take for granted, like lighting and heating, and just everything that kind of fuels your daily lifestyle has come from this development. So it had a cost, but it also took away a cost, which was a cost to humans, which I would argue, humans need to be factored into this idea of how we protect nature going forward, because we are part of nature. And that's another thing that, is sometimes missing from these environmental conversations. So yeah, this brings me on to what does poverty look like? So this is a picture of me sat on my mother. In the other picture, I'm being carried by my cousin. So my parents migrated here in the 70s and 80s from a little village in northern India, in the Punjab. It's just a tiny village. It doesn't have a name. It's 4 hours from the nearest hospital. There's no public transport. There's no electricity. They live. I mean, actually, this picture with my mum in this is a more wealthy version of what my parents grew up with, and that's because my parents sent money over to their family over there, so they're able to have more things and stable structures and things like that. But actually, I often make this point that we do take our lives for granted. We do take it for granted that we have the highest quality of life in the world. That's not to say that there aren't social problems. Of course, there are many, and I'm not here to discuss those today, but ultimately my parents chose to leave behind all their family, which is very important as well in Indian culture. They left behind their family, they left behind the only country they'd ever lived in, they left behind their language to get on a boat and come to a place. Basically, they were offered jobs in Birmingham, where there was a lot of industry at the time in factories, and they took those jobs because they wanted to escape poverty. And that is what people will do to have access to clean water and central heating in the winter and lighting, lighting outside when it's dark when it's dark in this part of rural India, it's just very, very dark. You know, it's hard to impress upon when you've grown, as I have grown up in this culture that's very, very rich, really, and very highly dependent on both electricity and unfortunately at the moment fossil fuels. Doesn't have to be that way, and I'll cover that shortly. But I like to make this point because as an environmentalist for a long time, I had to hold these ideas in my head about where my parents came from, why they left behind that life and essentially embraced development, and why all the people around me who really cared about the environment, same as me, and really wanted to make a difference would say, we need to all go back to living on the land like these people. You know, to me, this idyllic vision of living on the land means, you know, it's quite a lot of, there is a lot of infant mortality. There's a lot of disability where people can't get access to health. There's no access to healthcare, even with my parents sending money over to their family after they left. Money can only go so far if there's no access to be able to buy medication. You know, I'll give you an example. I have a cousin in this village still, and he's my age, and he had epileptic fits when he was a kid. Now, in this country, a close friend of mine, his daughter also had epileptic fits, and they put her on several different medications before they were able to stop the fitting. Basically, what happened is it prevented her from, it prevented her brain from being damaged from these fits because she was very little and she was having seizures a lot. They tried all these different medications. They got her the help she needed, and now she's a healthy 4-year-old girl. She's completely fine. She's going to have really good quality of life. My cousin in India, despite the fact that my parents sent money for medication, they couldn't get access to the medication because they lack the development that we have. They don't have access to healthcare. That comes with what we did, which was developing and burning a lot of fossil fuels. And a consequence of that is my cousin, who is my age, is completely confined, I would say, to a wheelchair, but they don't have wheelchairs. So he's confined to a chair all the time, and he's carried from place to place, and he can't speak. And I find it very sad when I last went over there, which was in my early 20s. I find it very sad thinking that, you know, that could be any of us, and that it's entirely avoidable, actually. And we should think about poverty when we talk about environmental issues, and we should think about social justice issues. And there's a lot more awareness of that now, actually, I would say, than 10 years ago even. But we still need to think about it more, because I go to I'm speaking at COP28 this year, and all the time I see this finger pointing, well, these are the countries that are burning a lot of fossil fuels. And I don't think you can blame these countries. I don't think you can blame India or China or Africans for wanting stable electricity and wanting the development that we had. They didn't cause climate change, so we can't really blame them, especially when our own electricity grid is so dirty, which actually, you know, few countries in Europe have decarbonized, and certainly we haven't. We have about a 60% fossil fuel mix here in the UK, which is entirely necessary. So so my perspective was different, and I knew it was different, but I was involved in these groups and in protests because that was just the one channel. It was the one way you could approach environmentalism. And when I would say things like, well, you know, the data shows that actually when people get access to electricity, it becomes an equalizer, and they can have the developments, and they can have, you know, education, and, you know, all the things that we have today, I would be told that's not the right way, that's the wrong way, we shouldn't do that, there must be another way. Well, you know, if you show me data that there's another way, I'll believe you, but historically there isn't another way. This is it, and this is what the world will continue to do. And I will make an argument for clean energy, don't worry, but I also think we need to acknowledge that it's not as black and white as I thought it was when I was a teenager protesting investment in fossil fuels. It's much more complicated, and it's certainly much more complicated when you start talking about something as specific as oil, where at the moment there aren't perfect replacements. And actually, you know, it's interesting, right? It's interesting because we are making waves. So for our electricity grid, terrible. We should be doing a lot better. We could do a lot better. We're not but it's not impossible. Technologically, we could do it, instigate a plan tomorrow and decarbonise within 10 years. But we are upping our electric vehicles. And as you saw earlier, that's about half of our consumption of oil. So that's quite a lot that we will be able to replace. And this is really important. If you don't know gapminder.org, basically, we don't understand the world as well as we think we do. I think we talk about this a lot as humanists anyway, that there's so many different cognitive biases that come into thinking about these issues. And I think actually environmentalism somehow has kind of slipped through the net with this. Like there's people don't often really take a magnifying glass and put a strong lens on, what are they saying? How achievable is it? Is it right? And I would say that actually, as environmentalists, we got a lot of things wrong. We've done a lot of things wrong. And there's now a lot more debate about that, but there wasn't for a long time. And some of the things we were protesting were solutions. Some of the calling out of technology, actually, they were life-saving technologies, and we shouldn't have done that. And this myth of the simple life is just sad, and we absolutely need to get away from that. And I still hear that today. People say, well, for the sake of the planet, we can't let these people develop. I urge them to go and tell my relatives in India that, or many of the billions of people that still live in poverty, or the millions that still live in extreme poverty, who will only, this will only get better through development and access to electricity. It doesn't have to be fossil fuels anymore. That's the good news. We'll get onto that in a minute. But I also want to say that educating women in these areas and giving them access to contraception is one of the best ways to reduce population in those areas. That has been shown to work. But I also want to point out the population myth, as well as being wrong in predicting mass famine and death and people should be sterilized. Actually, population decline is now occurring everywhere in the world except Africa. And some countries, Japan, for example, are really suffering with it because they've got this aging population, and they don't have enough people to look after them. There are care homes in Japan where they're using robots and a combination of AI technology to help look after people because there aren't enough care workers, which actually is quite interesting and in some ways seems to be working really well. But there are myths and things we got wrong, and then there are actually problems that we haven't foreseen, and we still aren't really thinking about, like, how is this going to impact human well-being or even the environment when you don't have when you don't tackle these issues, like the fact that population decline is a huge issue, actually. So quality of life improves with development and access to electricity. This Gapminder is really good because if you don't know, it was set up by the late statistician Hans Rosling. He was brilliant at he gave TED lectures and things on this, kind of taking people's assumptions and just absolutely blowing them apart. You don't have to take my word for it. Go on to Gapminder and take the test. I highly doubt anyone will get all the questions right, because we all have this thing called negativity bias, right? It creeps in. We start, I do it as well. I look at the news, very upsetting things make me feel that everything's terrible. But actually, on almost every measure, we've improved things like, access for people's access to water or basic clean water, drinking water, or basic sanitation, lifting more people out of extreme poverty and also poverty. All of these things have improved in my lifetime, and this is a really good thing because, apart from during the pandemic where some of these issues stalled, these things are all on an upward trajectory. So the world's actually getting better overall. And I know that sounds crazy to you, but actually, it's true. B, when tested on some of these issues, even politicians that Rosling went around and interviewed, and people that worked in this field who you'd expect to know well actually didn't fare very well. In some case, monkeys pressing random answers did better than the humans. So I always say I agree completely with Rosling's philosophy about minding your gap, because I don't think you can fix the world's problems if you don't understand what those problems really are and look at what the evidence-based solutions are that have helped to improve in all of these areas. And we have also done it for sustainability. And this is something that, again, it sounds counterintuitive, but it's absolutely true. If you think of resource use, we've gotten really good at innovating and using fewer resources. That's not to say that consumption is a problem overall, But if you think about something like your phone, your smartphone, having a smartphone still has an environmental cost. Okay, everything has an environmental cost. And I'm not claiming that it doesn't use lots of materials. It does. But if you compare it with what happened before the phone, you had to have a landline, you had a GPS device, you had a compass, you had a calculator, you had lots of things that are now in one device. That innovation has actually reduced consumption overall, because now most people don't own all of those products. Those products don't require all those resources because they're not being bought as much, because most people can just have a phone. It's also, you know, a great equalizer because a lot of people can't afford all of those things, especially in some more of the developing countries, but they might be able to have access to a phone, which, you know, gives them a wealth of knowledge that they previously were denied, basically. So, you know, some of these things have actually been solved because there are so many people, because we are really good at innovating and working together. And it's made very clear on Gapminder if you want to know more about it. So, okay, we've established we're moving over to electric vehicles. That's great. Also, there's a move from gas boilers to heat pumps. That's a lot slower. They're very expensive. There's a lot of misinformation actually about heat pumps. But as we make these transitions away from fossil fuels, we will reduce reliance on fossil fuels, but because we're still relying on the grid and the electricity grid is still heavily fueled by fossil fuels, it's an improvement. It's an incremental improvement, but it's not enough. It's not enough to be able to say we're just stopping these things. Not at all. So we need to be really, really realistic about where we get our energy from. This is just the data that's out there. These are the countries that have done it. And some of these countries, you know, like France, they decarbonized in the 1980s. So they've had a clean grid since before I was born. While, you know, Britain, we've kind of faffed around and just kind of forgotten how to build things and get moving. We could decarbonize very quickly if we wanted to. And decarbonizing the grid is essential for stopping reliance on fossil fuels. I mean, I feel like, you know, that you probably think that's really obvious, but go and tell our politicians, please. Because actually, this is what works. If you're geographically lucky and you have a lot of hydropower, then great, you can use a lot of hydropower. But even those countries that have a lot of hydropower tend to still need some wind, solar, nuclear, and they might have a tiny bit of fossil fuels. But, you know, the aim is really to decarbonize as much as possible. So as we electrify everything, which is a really important step in this, especially in moving away from oil, as we discussed with electric vehicles, and gas with heat pumps, we need to make sure that our grid is clean. And I always come back to this point because we cannot point at other countries, at poorer countries, and say, well, look, their grid's really dirty and they're burning coal, when we in the developed world are still burning coal. And we are in Britain. We burn it in Britain. We don't burn it here because we don't want the air pollution, but we're quite happy to export that cost to some poor, marginalised community in, for example, Poland. And I have spoken to people in Poland who live near coal-fired power stations, and they tell me, well, I say near, they're miles away, but, you know, stuff travels. And they say they can't even open their windows because they're perpetually covered in filth, and they have children with high numbers of respiratory issues and cancers and all the things that, you know, should concern us as a social justice issue within the environmental movement or within humanist principles or anything really. You know, we are exporting that cost. We would never allow a coal-fired power station to be built here, and I think that's right, but we do export that cost. And if you look at the data, it is exported onto minority groups and the most marginalized and poor people, because, like I found when I spoke to this family in Poland, they can't afford to move away. So that's why they're stuck. They're stuck essentially living with the consequences of our lifestyles. And it doesn't have to be that way, because we can see here that there are solutions. And I'm coming over to nuclear energy now. I mention this a lot. Again, you know, to me, this is obvious. It's no different than saying that climate change is real or vaccinations save lives. The consensus of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is that we need nuclear to decarbonize. We also need wind and solar. Absolutely. We need all the clean energy. It's not about making clean energy fight with each other. It's about stopping fossil fuels. Therefore, we need a lot of clean energy. Up here is a page from the 1.5 warming report that came out in 2018, where the IPCC got together and crunched the numbers. How are we going to decarbonize? And these are the 4 different scenarios that show different ways it could be done, but all of them involve increasing nuclear by quite a lot. And I make this point because I've been part of a movement that has been against nuclear for a long time, and that's another area where I think we got it wrong. And weirdly as well, we kind of didn't like it because it's technology, but then it doesn't make sense logically, because solar panels are also technology, and wind turbines are also infrastructure and technology. So, there's a lot of different reasons that we got confused. There's a lot of misinformation out there. A lot of us were misled. I say misinformation, but I will point out that The Simpsons, I'm sure, was not doing it intentionally, but I would say that pop culture played a role in fueling the misinformation accidentally, because, when I was growing up, it was so normal. Who was the most evil person in The Simpsons? It wasn't a fossil fuel corporation, it was the nuclear industry boss. Whereas actually I've met nuclear workers, and they have unionized jobs. These are really good jobs. These are really good working class people. Where these stereotypes came from, I don't know, but these stereotypes are very powerful. That's me in a picture protesting nuclear when I was in my early 20s. So I was protesting fossil fuels, but I was also protesting one of the solutions. That's another thing that we got wrong. All you really need to see is this. This is from Our World in Data. It's very good data. I would recommend, if you're interested, to actually go to Our World in Data, look at the whole section on this. So I've just taken the little infographic, but there's a whole page, breaks down all the numbers, all the information. You can look at it for yourself, and all you really need to see here is we have to wean off these fossil fuels. We absolutely have to. Everything else is clean and safe, and it's great. But and this includes, because somebody will ask in the questions, I will preempt you, it does include all the disasters. So it includes all the disasters that have happened with nuclear energy. It does include those. A lot of the toll to human life there is lower than people expect. It's something that I used to be misinformed about as well. Fossil fuels, we all know about the oil spills, Deepwater Horizon spill, or the Jaria coal fires. Maybe you don't know about that. These are coal fires that have been raging for hundreds of years. Underground in India, people actually live. If you look up Jaria coal fires, people actually live in these zones where the ground is on fire underneath, because the coal mining ended up sparking a fire that they can't put out, that has raged for decades, and people just live there and they're just breathing this in, and it's really horrific, actually. These are the numbers we know about. I would argue there's probably even more going on with the fossil fuels than we realize here. The reason hydropower is up there, again, because somebody was likely to ask, is because actually something like the Banqiao disaster in China did have quite a high death toll. I don't know why we didn't then go and protest it the way we did with nuclear disasters, when actually the toll was hundreds of thousands of people who were washed away, their entire villages washed away by that disaster. But I would, if you look at it in context, which I think is really important with data like this, I wouldn't say don't build hydropower. We absolutely need it. If you're geographically able to build it and use it, try to mitigate for things like those disasters and try to protect people. But ultimately, at the moment, most of the world is dependent on these much more dangerous options, and we should keep that in mind. Another point I make, this was actually one of the things that kind of sold me on nuclear, was looking at material use and land use. So land use, it has the smallest footprint of all energy sources. Partly this is because of energy density, as this XKCD panel illustrates. This is UN data. This is mostly because they last a long time, so they'll last 60 plus years, whereas solar panels and wind turbines will last 20 to 25 years. Still fine, I think, build it all, but obviously that means that if you're replacing those things twice within the lifetime of a nuclear plant, then it requires more materials. So, I mean, you're going to need oil to build all of these things. There is no getting around that, I still think there is a point where we can transition away from oil and all fossil fuels, but it's not right now. We have to, as well as hoping for more innovations in the oil area, at least, and more funding, I would say that actually we just need to focus on the things that we know are friendliest to nature and build those. And just a quick slide on solar power, because I know, again, a lot of you will be thinking, well, can't solar just do it? Well, no, actually. As I showed in the decarbonisation graphs, pie charts, you can't do it with just solar or wind. I won't say renewables, because actually hydropower can carry a lot of the load. Hydropower is very reliable, but it's geographically constrained. Not everywhere can have it. So we can have solar here and we can have wind, but we're not going to get wind all the time. Although actually Britain has a ban on onshore wind anyway. And you're not going to get sun all the time. What that means is there's a dip. It's known as the duck curve. Because it looks like a duck on the graph. And what it means is you need a baseload capacity to take over, a baseload generation. That is always historically either from fossil fuels, usually coal, or nuclear power. And actually a lot of our nuclear power plants are quite old now and they're closing down. So that capacity, that generation is going to reduce. And what that means is we will end up using more fossil fuels unless we very quickly replace them, which we're not doing. We are building Hinkley and Sizewell, but they will not replace the old power plants that are shutting down, Heysham and the others, which are, they're very old, they're being decommissioned. So actually it's likely that our emissions will go up, not down. So, and the last thing to cover about this is waste. I get asked about waste a lot. What about nuclear waste? It's well managed. It's never harmed anybody. I understand there's a lot of fears around it. I used to be very afraid of it. I think it's interesting that we talk about and worry about nuclear waste. We never talk about fossil fuel waste, which is being stored in the Earth's atmosphere and isn't managed, and we don't have a way of managing it. And it kills lots of people. And again, I think we made a mistake by ignoring this. Again, more people are talking about it now. Certainly, I bang this drum all the time. That can we please talk about air pollution, because it drastically impacts quality of life. It hurts the most marginalised, poor communities, again, because they can't afford to move out of these areas, or they work in these areas in coal-fired power stations or things like that. And these are preventable deaths because we have the technology to transition away from them, as well as then the longer term impacts of climate change, which fossil fuels are driving. You have to think, why hasn't air pollution been a more important issue for people? I mean, we're talking about 8 to 9 million deaths a year from fossil fuel generated air pollution alone. Not talking about roads and traffic. I'm talking about fossil fuels. And why don't we worry about that enough? Again, these are the most marginalized communities. If you look at the data, they are the people that are most impacted by this. They're the ones that have to live with it, and therefore they get the least say, I think. And yeah, I like to highlight this because actually we should talk about fossil fuel waste. We should talk about it a lot more. We should be a lot more afraid of it, because if you want to talk about invisible killers, it's fossil fuel waste, Again, this graph shows it. Yeah, so what works? Something positive. So France has a really clean energy grid. They did this in the 80s. They had a plan. They had an oil crisis in the 80s. And their prime minister at the time said, France doesn't have oil, but we have ideas, which I thought was a nice way of phrasing it. And they basically started this nuclear program. They have built a lot of renewables as well, but they started a massive nuclear program. They wanted to build over 50 reactors, and they built 50 something in the end. And they did a huge drive of getting the engineers trained, paying them well, unionized jobs, build these things, decarbonize. They did it. They did it before we were even worrying really about climate change. And they did it in 10 years. So why hasn't the West done this? Well, we've had the wealth and the knowledge and the ability to do it. I think it's sad, and I think part of it is because we've been misled by fear-mongering about technologies that we desperately need to solve climate change and air pollution and other issues. And yeah, it's the same with coming off of oil. It won't happen just by turning off a tap. In fact, if you turned off a tap, lots of people would die, just like in the energy crisis that we've now all experienced, it's got people thinking about energy more for the first time. I find going through a winter, worrying about whether you're going to have to ration. I mean, in some countries they did. In Germany they did, for example, because we don't have enough. that, that's the reality for millions of people, billions of people in the world who don't have regular access to electricity. And actually you realize how crucial it is to everything, to not just so that you can read after dark, but so that your hospitals stay running, and so that your vaccinations in your hospitals can be maintained at the right temperature, so they're not just, they stop working when they're not at that temperature, and all these other things that we kind of take for granted. We can have a solid plan, we can build lots of clean energy, or we could do the opposite. So Germany is an example where they did the opposite. In Germany, they had a plan called Energiewende. It was to phase out anything that wasn't classed as renewable. So they phased out coal, which is good, in my opinion. It needs to be done. But they also phased out 11 nuclear power stations. And then what happened is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, energy crisis everywhere. They couldn't meet their need. They did spend trillions on solar and wind, brilliant, but those need backup, and they got rid of all their base load generation. They got rid of coal because they should, it's dirty, right? It's polluting. Yep, we need to phase out fossil fuels, but they also got rid of nuclear because they had these old ideas, that it's scary and dangerous. And a consequence of this actually is this paper, and there's more research since here, but this is an interesting one because it was led by Professor James Hansen. If you don't know who that is, he's known as the grandfather of climate science. He was the first climate scientist to testify in Congress to say that climate change is real and we need to deal with it. He was calling it global warming at the time. He crunched the numbers on what happened when Germany shut these nuclear power stations, because what happened is they then reopened. They had to reopen their mothballed coal-fired power stations, so they've gone back to coal. They've also, you've probably seen that image of the village being bulldozed with the protesters one side and the bulldozer on the other side. And the reason they bulldozed it is because they wanted the coal, which Germany does have a lot of. But it's lignite, and it's the dirtiest substance on the planet for generating electricity. So that was the decision they made, and there are consequences, and the consequence is that more people die. And yeah, this is a really good paper on that, and there's lots more research on that. So I'm not the only one banging this drum now. There's lots of people. So you've got James Hansen there and writing in the Guardian, as well as numerous other well-known climate scientists, and George Monbiot, who's been he's been talking about this for a while, to be fair. There have been people talking about it. But what I would say is this has shifted, and people are much more behind the consensus now that we need all the clean energy desperately, all the tools in the kit, whether it's pyrolysis or nuclear or even carbon capture storage that is in the IPCC. If we can have these technologies, brilliant. We desperately need to fight climate change. We desperately need to stop pumping fossil fuel waste into our atmosphere, and we need to think about the impact this is having on human life on the planet overall. But something that we haven't changed the narrative on is this idea that we need to stop using energy. This is a really old idea embedded in that first kind of iteration of the movement that said there's too many people are bad. I would argue that's wrong. People are part of nature and also deserve to be protected, and we are protecting this for us as well as because we should be caretakers of the land around us, and that means making sensible evidence-based decisions. And actually, as I've illustrated with the example of the smartphone, where innovation actually in that area reduced our consumption, which is the opposite of what people think, that if you buy more of these things, you're just fueling this machine. Well, actually, it's reduced it. Same thing with cars. There's a saying that a car in the 1970s that was just parked on the side of the street was more polluting than a car now going 100 miles per hour. The reason for that is because they were so inefficient in the 70s. They would just leak substances just parked there. They were heavy, so they used a lot of fuel. They were just less efficient. And over time, we've improved. So actually almost, on quite a lot of measures, we have improved all of these things. And obviously we should continue to improve them. But one thing that will not happen is that we will start using a lot less energy. We are a highly energy rich society, and we have a lot of the world that is becoming energy rich and wants to be energy rich. We just need to think about where that energy comes from. It just needs to be clean. And it comes down to making evidence-based decisions. And if you look at what happened in Germany, they did not make an evidence-based decision. They chose ideology over science. And we're still falling for this old idea that electricity is bad. No, it's not. It's enabled us all to have good a good quality of life. It means that our children live past infancy. Take my parents as an example. Both of my parents have siblings, you know, in double digits. Like my mum had, I think, 11, but several. I mean, they passed away, right? Because they didn't live that long. And my dad came from like 15 or 16. I didn't meet most of them. Again, most of them passed away. But the point is, then their children did not have 17 children. In fact, half of their children, they came over here and had 6, which was already quite a lot, but you know, culturally, that was normal to them. And most of those children didn't have children. Access to, you know, education, contraception, healthcare. This reduces impacts on the environment naturally, and it's you know, it's a strong argument, I think, for including poverty in assessments of how to stop climate change, because these poor nations desperately want the lifestyles that we have, and they're not going to stop wanting them. And you know, I've even heard environmentalists say, well, why don't they care about the environment? And I say, well, it's not that they don't care. You know, you have to appreciate the way that quite a lot of the world lives, and that we are very wealthy and very fortunate, but we certainly can't finger point and say that they're not doing a good job when they're opening new coal-fired power stations, which they are in India and China, because they just want what we had. But they're also opening a lot of nuclear power plants, and China's building more solar capacity than anywhere in the world. So they're already thinking ahead to that transition as well, which again, I think is positive. There are good things happening, but we definitely don't get to say something that I've heard at COPs, which is just give them solar panels. That is not what we had to develop. We burned a lot of fossil fuels. Let's just accept that. We use a lot of oil. Our lifestyles are entirely dependent on this. And unless we want to go and live in a village in India, and I guarantee you, all my cousins there would gladly swap with you or me to live here and have all the things that we have. We have to make sure that we can help, rather than finger pointing. We can help these nations to wean off of fossil fuels, because ultimately will impact us all. But you know, I feel that there could be some reparations there. We could help fund clean energy programs, but not just intermittent energy. They're going to need a lot more than that, and they say that very clearly at the COP events. I've heard the Indian Minister for Energy say it. So I make the case for evidence-based environmentalism. This is actually surprisingly popular now. When I first started doing it a few years ago, it was because I was in Extinction Rebellion. I felt it was very negative. I constantly had people saying that we lived the wrong way, and you know, we're bad for living this way, and I just couldn't see it. I realized actually that I just can't see the world that way anymore. You know, I'm minding my gap here, and you know, I'm very privileged. I recognize that, and I would like to use that voice to call attention to things that work. Technology isn't all bad. It's about how you use it. And trying to have, you know, put some voice in there for, again, the most marginalized people that you do not hear from, the people that have to live by the coal-fired power station so that we can have lighting. You know, these are not, you know, these are not necessary. These are things that we could very quickly change. I'd love to see a movement that was fighting for that. You know, and I founded my group, Emergency Reactor, because we sort of tried to do that, and we've definitely helped to get the conversation moving a little bit. But there's still a lot of these old myths kicking around, and they are not evidence-based at all. And if you look at, you know, the consequences of that, just look at what's happened in Germany. So that, yeah, I think the old narrative needs to change. We should follow science, not slogans. We do need to electrify everything. Most of us do kind of accept that, but we need to think about the grid that we're then relying on. That electrifying everything means we will use more electricity, not less. This idea that we will use less is just an old idea based on a myth. It doesn't matter if we use more, if it's clean and if it's done responsibly. As for oil, that's not going to happen overnight. It's actually going to be extremely difficult. People would die if we made the decision now to just stop using oil. It's used in, you know, everything from regular medicines, clothing, things that we rely on every day. There's certainly, you know, some things you can get shoes or umbrellas without oil, sure. But not everything, not some medicines, not some things that are really crucial to the way that we live. You know, and we talked about this being a little bit of a controversial, topic, and I stand by it. I've been told you can't be pro-technology and be an environmentalist, and I say to those people, I earned my stripes in this movement. I earned my stripes in this movement when I was arrested at Kingsnorth protesting coal power. I was 22. It was a young age to be arrested. It was not treated well. Then happened again, protesting tar sands when he shut down the bank. I've written a book. I've written the book on how to live with a low carbon footprint, but I've changed my mind that should be the focus. We should all do that, but let's be honest, I don't know anybody who is purposefully wasting lighting or deliberately, wasting electricity. Most people are very conscientious about it. And frankly, it costs them money to do that anyway. So why would they? Most people are trying to save up and buy an electric vehicle or a heat pump or looking into those options. Most people are getting solar panels for their roofs if they own their home and they're able to. A lot of people are making these decisions all the time just off their own back. People are very concerned, especially in Britain. Again, the polls significantly, consistently show that we are very concerned about the environment. Even during the pandemic, it was still at one of our top three concerns. So, it's hopeful. There's a lot happening, but we just need to make sure that we're honest. We're honest about what the solutions are. And you don't have to trust me on all this. If you have a look at my Substack, I've written on depth on all of these different issues, and I write regularly on there. And the reason I'm pointing there is because everything there is heavily referenced. So you can go and check it for yourself. You don't have to just believe me. You can find the links to our World in Data or the IPCC or whatever you want to see. And also just add, I'm independent of industry. I get paid for my writing and speaking, but I do not work with any industry at all and never have done so. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sion, for a very interesting, very enlightening talk. And we are getting questions coming through, lots of different names on there. So let's start with a very nice question from David Good. He says, "Hi, Zian. It's very refreshing to hear someone talking about an evidence-based approach to environmentalism and challenging some of the myths that are so often shared. How can we get involved in this approach?"
Thanks, David. So I run a group called Emergency Reactor, and we try to do actions. It's not anything illegal. It's mostly things like information stalls, handing out bananas, talking to people about clean energy, why it's important. Mostly I would say, it's really important to have these conversations. It's one of the best things you can do because people just don't talk about it. It's kind of just, everyone just believes, we energy's bad, let's not use that. And it's actually kind of dangerous, right? As I've shown in my talk, hopefully. An email to an MP saying, do you support removing the ban on onshore wind? There's a ban on onshore wind in this country. You can't build it. Do you support removing the ban? Can we get solar panels? Do you support solar panels? What's happening with nuclear? How are you going to move that along? These are actually really important because MPs will listen. They will pay attention. What they tend to get is complaints from people, in my experience. And when I've spoken to some of these MPs, they're becoming very put off by environmentalists because they get negative things sent all the time and no solutions. And the other thing is they're often they don't necessarily have a high level of science literacy. So they actually don't know. If you ask them, how do you stop oil? I don't know. It's in everything. Well, just have those conversations and opening an avenue and getting them thinking about it can have, widespread repercussions. And I found that has helped. Me doing that has helped. So I would encourage everybody to go and write to their MP and see what's happening in your area, and and also have conversations with friends about it. I think this is an underrated thing now. We all rely on social media, but if you want to change minds, it's that face-to-face communication that really makes a difference.
I'll just jump in there and say, if you were inspired by the theme of Zion's talk and you like the idea of evidence-based climate activism, as well as Emergency Reactor, there's the Humanists UK network, Humanist Climate Action. You can get involved with that by going to humanist.uk/climate, and we'll if you're on our email list, we'll tell you more about it later on. But yeah, that's another way you can get involved with other like-minded people who want to take this sort of frame to environmental questions as well. So thank you very much for that question, David. I'm going to go over to Jill Baird's question now, because we've gone from a very nice, not planted we swear question to this one that's very practical. So Jill asks, I need to replace my gas boiler. A
Mhm.
new one will be more efficient and cost £2,500. The question just jumped as I'm reading it as someone pressed one. I would like to have to go for an electric system, but I've been quoted over £10,000 for an electric system. What do I do?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, again, put pressure on your politicians to subsidize these things because most people can't afford them. Equally, a lot of people live in rented houses and can't make these decisions. I personally think we should just be retrofitting houses with whatever's cleaner at, that cost should be paid, because if you think about the longer term costs of depending on fossil fuels, even just the cost to the NHS from air pollution, I think this transition needs a massive kick up the bum. And you're right, you're right about gas. I understand that. I've also spoken to people who work as people who fit gas boilers, and they are worried because they say, what will happen when they're phased out? I won't have a job. And I completely hear them. They need retraining. Why aren't they being retrained if we're switching to heat pumps? There's a lot of things that need to happen. It needs to be cheaper. The advice and expertise needs to be offered freely. The workers need to have a fair transition. Nobody ever talks or thinks about the workers. Again, I would just encourage you to have those conversations and contact your politicians, because it really can make a difference. And if you don't do it, nobody's doing it. These conversations are not being had.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I was reading is that with state level investment in clean technology, then the price of energy will keep going down, but there isn't a mechanism that will bring down the price of crude oil or carbon-based energy. That, with inflation and with its diminishing resources, will continue to stay the same or go up. So it's definitely difficult at the moment as individuals, but collectively through organizations, we can hopefully start to put pressure on people.
Liam, can I answer Dennis as well?
Yes, go for it.
Do you think we can decarbonize before we pollute the atmosphere to the point of not supporting life? Absolutely, but it's not about what I think. My talk was not just about what I think, it was how I inform my thinking using evidence. There is no consensus that it is too late to take these actions. There is no timeline. You will hear this 4 years, this 11 years, it changes all the time. There is no evidence that we will get to that point anytime soon. Now, if we do nothing, eventually, yes, our atmosphere will be like Venus's atmosphere, which cannot support life. That's a long way away. There is a lot of time between now and then, and any incremental difference we make to the increased warming, whether we stay below 1.5 degrees or not, is going to make a huge difference to the life on this planet. So yes, absolutely, we can decarbonize. We could do it in 10 years. The entire world could do it in 10 years if we really wanted to.
I wonder if socially we're suffering from the bystander effect on this, because I think the idea of a deadline or minutes to midnight is a concept that's meant to make us sort of snap out of it. And if you say, well, actually, it's not 1 year, it's not 10 years, it might be 20, it might be 30, that is that sort of big sigh of relief that we can all have, that we can do something. And some of the rhetoric that you might get in climate protests is, well, we haven't got time, we've run out of time. And there is a guilt that I think people probably should feel for future generations. But then how do we get around this cognitive, if that is what it is, or if you agree that that's what it is, what can we do for ourselves or for other people?
Yeah.
What's a humanist alternative to that?
I mean, yeah, I think it is. I think that, it is negativity bias. It is bystander effect. It is a combination of lots of things. And also just being overwhelmed. When I started reading up on specifically on oil, like, it's quite overwhelming. I went down this rabbit hole of pyrolysis. I was like, you know what? They don't need this much information. There are experts that have this information. We just need to make sure that we put it in their hands and let them make the decisions. I think you could say that with anything. Look at how the pandemic was managed. Those decisions should be made by the experts. Then it should be filtered through the decision makers and go through a democratic process. But ultimately, we're not very good at doing it, and we're not very good at thinking ahead of ourselves either. And this is a wide problem. It's very hard. I also find it hard to think on a large enough scale. Like, what will life be past the point where I'm alive? What will it be like for my children? So I just think about the immediate problems. That's just a normal human reaction. I don't think anybody is really doing this on purpose, wanting people to suffer. I think it's hard to think on a wider scale, but that's why I recommend things like Gapminder, because it forces you into that thinking, and it can really make you see the world differently. And I think we need to be able to see these issues differently in order to effectively tackle them. I don't think there's one solution. I think it's understanding things in a fundamental way so that we know that we're putting our energy into evidence-based solutions rather than just, our own inherent biases.
Yeah, keep your questions coming in, everyone. Some questions are very similar, so if we answer one that's quite similar to yours, we might go to a slightly different one. I've got one here from Anne Cheese, who says, "Thank you, Zian, for a very interesting and evidence-driven talk. One of the big challenges with nuclear is the link to nuclear weapons. We're happy for some countries to pursue nuclear, but deny this tech to other countries, which also we need to develop. How do we decouple nuclear energy from nuclear weapons? And are new modular reactors an answer?" I don't know what that means, e.g. thorium reactors.
Oh, okay. So thank you, Anne, for your question. So there's only a few countries in the world that aren't allowed to have a nuclear program. So we have the nuclear non-nuclear proliferation treaty that quite a lot of countries have signed up to. It's a myth that weapons are linked to energy, because actually there's a great slide on this that I didn't include, but actually quite a lot of countries have one or the other. Because they're expensive, right? So they'll either put money into an energy program or they'll put it into a weapon. So Korea is a good example. One half, North Korea, has lots of weapons, and South Korea has lots of clean energy. They've built lots of nuclear power plants quite recently, actually, and very quickly. In 4 years, they've managed to build a bunch of new reactors. So yeah, it's an old myth that, yes, okay, you could say the fuel can be used, but the fuel can be accessed by anyone who can dig up, uranium. But you have to do complicated things to the uranium to turn it into something you can use as a weapon. And there's very few people in the world with that knowledge. And that's not really the issue, and I don't think that knowledge will disappear from the world either. So, it's good that people sign up to the treaty, even if they choose to have a weapons program. I would love to see a reduce in weapons and an increase in energy. That to me is the best use of these resources. If we're fighting a war, climate change, hello, and air pollution. And yep, modular reactors, so small modular reactors. Lumi said you didn't know what they are. They are like mini nuclear reactors, new technology that's coming forward. I say new, but it has been used in the past. It's being used on submarines and things like that. But there's a lot of different companies now competing with slightly different reactor designs. Quite a few of them are in Britain, actually, trying to create something that's really cheap and easy to replicate, so that basically we'll get them built. And the government has invested in that because they're very interested in this small modular technology, and also they like it because it does produce barely any waste. But I would still say that the waste that is produced by current power plants is just not significant. Like, it's highly blown out of proportion. So yeah, I would say it is an answer, but at the moment they're not ready to build out, and at the moment we need the solutions that we have on the table. But we should still fund advanced solar panels or advanced nuclear reactors as well, because anything that helps us along will help to solve the climate crisis.
While we're on nuclear, and you touched on nuclear safety there, I'm going to go to Stephen Lindsay's question, because I think maybe some people would benefit from the same answer. So he says he agrees with you on the need for nuclear energy, but surely there are difficulties dealing with the waste that mean it's only safe until it's not safe. How do we think about the future with nuclear?
Yeah, so the waste has never harmed anyone, but I'm not going to pretend that it's not dangerous. I mean, most waste isn't dangerous. Most waste from a power plant is it's like medical waste. So you think nuclear medicine, right? Like the gloves have to be put in a special compartment, and they have to go and be incinerated, and everything that you've been wearing and all the equipment in nuclear medicine, right? Nuclear medicine creates nuclear waste, exactly the same as a nuclear power plant. The difference is the power plant creates a small amount of very condensed radioactive waste, but it has a very short half-life. It's not, people think, it's radioactive for millions of years. Well, no, it has a very short half-life, so it very quickly becomes less radioactive. It's a tiny amount. They store it in a huge storage cask. If you look online, there is a picture of me hugging one of these casks because I went to have a look at it, but it was very boring and unexciting. Nothing can be done with these casks. They test them. If you go to YouTube and you put in nuclear fuel storage cask test, or put in plane test, they test these casks by flying mini planes into them, right? It's not very environmentally friendly, but originally they were tested like that. And you'd see this plane would shatter into pieces and the cask wouldn't move. It's almost ridiculously safe. It's almost like stupidly safe. Now, still, ideally, you don't want the cask sitting around. I agree with that. So Finland has got an approach to this. They've just built the world's first deep geological storage facility. It's literally just putting what they took out of the ground back underground. They're actually talking about taking other countries' waste. I think they're probably going to make money out of this. Finnish people are overwhelmingly pro-nuclear. They have a nuclear energy program. Their Fridays for the Future supports it. Their Greenpeace doesn't protest it. Their Green Party is the only Green Party in the world in Finland where they fully support nuclear openly. I don't know what's happening in Finland that makes it so special. Great education system, I think. But yeah, that is a way to do it long term. It's just put it back underground. That's what the consensus is. But I would say it really is that safe that even at Fukushima, when Fukushima Daiichi melted down in Japan in 2011, there was waste stored on site. So that waste in those storage casks was hit by a tsunami and an earthquake, and it wasn't damaged. It didn't dent. Nothing happened. It really is that safe. I know it sounds crazy, but you can go and look it up. And I have written a very extensive piece on my Substack about waste. So if you go and have a look at that, all the resources, references are in there as well.
I think I'll go to one more question about nuclear, and then I might move on to some of the other themes. Alistair Nicholson says he's got no problem with nuclear in principle, but he's got a question about the sustainability of nuclear and the problem with uranium supply. He says that our world in data says 4% of primary energy is nuclear. What's he saying here? Scientific American, an article in the Scientific American magazine said uraniums had about a 200-year viable supply. And if we increase our usage of it, we'd only have 10 years of uranium. So
yeah,
are we recreating the problems that we have with fossil fuels?
We believed this in 2009, and it was the same with oil, wasn't it? We were going to hit peak oil. There is so much more uranium. There is a good source. Is it whatisnuclear.org, I think, that calculated the actual numbers. I mean, we have an infinite supply of uranium. You have to remember you need a very, very tiny amount to power a nuclear reactor. I would argue if we're talking about resources, do we have enough resources for solar panels? Quite a lot of those resources come from China. Are we going to end up in a difficult situation like what's happened with Russia, where we are depending on one area for polysilicon, and some of it has been linked to Uyghur people? Nobody wants to hear this, but I'm going to say it. There is a Guardian article on it. It's been linked to camps. Why are the panels so cheap? These materials are being mined by slaves, by people in awful conditions. I'm not saying don't build the panels, but we need to find a replacement for that. We need to talk about the social justice aspect. None of these things will be done easily. All of them require a lot of resources. There are going to be a lot of challenges. I don't have all the answers, but I can only say that the IPCC already crunched the numbers. The consensus is we need to do all of this desperately. And anybody, who thinks that we should just skip some of them and we'll manage it is gambling with the future of the one known habitable planet in the universe. It really is that serious.
Now, if anyone's got any citations or they want to send information on afterwards, I'll be happy to read other views on these things. But I'm going to move on from nuclear for now. We might swing back if there's time, but actually I've been encouraging questions, and now quite a lot are with us. Someone asked, I'm going to find it now. I think his name was Flying Monkey. Yeah, so Flying Monkey asks about the non-existent meat tax that Rishi Sunak abolishing. So he said, should the government tax meat and dairy products so that people are more likely to go vegan and help the government? I guess this should a government, because it's sort of not really the UK government. We can broaden this out a bit. Should governments do this? A 2019 study found that livestock farming in the UK, although the UK produced 42 million tons of CO2. But is that something that governments can or should do? Is that a humanist approach to these sorts of issues?
It's stick and carrot. Yeah, it's stick and carrot, isn't it? But I think, again, there are broader issues here, because if you go and speak to farmers, they don't want this to happen, because this is their livelihoods and they need to be supported to growing other crops if we're going to make their products more expensive. I broadly don't. So I agree with the carbon tax. The carbon tax is very well thought out. Yeah, nobody wants to be taxed, but the carbon tax is worth reading up on, because it covers this without specifically targeting one product. And I think if you went after meat and dairy, you start a culture war that would never end. I mean, look at what's happening with the low traffic neighborhoods. This should be an easy, common sense thing to implement, but it's not. It is not. That is not happening like virtually anywhere in the Western world. I think taxes actually will just stoke up all the fears and counter protests, and all that does is slow us down. And especially if it's taxing people individually, which is how they would feel, because then people are already, let's be honest, they're struggling to put food on the table. A lot of people are, and if they go to buy some of these products and they're more expensive or they're harder to get hold of, then they are not going to be happy about climate action. I think the kind of individual cost we just need to do away with making people feel bad and guilty and making their lives harder. We need to look at large scale issues, helping the farmers who frankly have quite stressful jobs, and their jobs become more stressful because the climate is becoming more unreliable, helping them to transition to other crops, and then, you know, foster that transition, which again some countries are trying to do. For example, getting people to eat bugs. Again, this is causing like a lot of issues. People are scared of having to eat bugs, but actually some countries are doing it really well with it. I think I saw something in America where there's like an ice cream shop where they make it with bugs. I mean, look, I've been vegan for a long time. But I'm not selling bugs or anything. But actually, you know, they take a little bit of space. They're not carbon intensive. They have lots of oils. They have lots of vitamins. We probably do need to make these transitions. All I'm saying is that transitioning towards the things we need to do is much better than blocking people from doing the things that they want, because historically that's just not working for us. And actually, some of those measures now, for example, with low traffic neighborhoods, are being people, you know, councillors or MPs are backtracking on them because we are in a democracy and they will listen to loud voices. You can be a loud voice for this issue, but I think it would just it would foster that polarization that is happening in so many areas right now, but it doesn't foster progress when that polarization happens. So I wouldn't support that, but I do agree that we absolutely need to transition away from heavily meat and dairy diets. That the data on that is very clear.
And these are, whether it's meat or dairy, or whether it's whether the other levers that governments can pull. I mean, the point of the net zero targets is that we have these longer term transitions. As one industry winds down, because there's always losers in any economic change, another should be winding up.
Exactly.
And it shouldn't really hurt in the scale of one human lifetime. It should be the country transitions from towards electric cars, and companies start producing more electric cars and the price goes down. So,
and it's complicated, you know. You say meat, I mean, how much, I mean, this was in my book, right? Like, how much do you want to get into meat? Because if you think about beef, this is highly carbon intensive, right? But if you think about, you know, mussels or you know, chicken, actually that's not as carbon intensive. Chocolate is more carbon intensive. So should it even be just applied to meat? I think it gets very complicated again. The ideas we have around what we should or shouldn't be doing, but essentially we can all change what we're doing. It is not going to change the fact that our electricity is 60% fossil fuels. It is not going to change that. So let's not hyper focus too much on what we're doing and how we live.
Sort of sweat the small stuff thing. There's also the thought I was having was that you get into an issue where you, as they tax chocolate differently to different sweets, or tax different meats different amounts. It becomes more really about encouraging lifestyle changes. And you've seen, you know, that Gen Z consumes less alcohol and smokes less. Why is that? Because we've absorbed 30 years of messaging about
and there are more vegans and vegetarians as well, and it's very easy to find food that are alternatives, which is what has made it easier for people.
Right. So I'm going to go to Flying Monkey again because he's got some good questions. By 2050, nearly 200,000 properties in England may have to be abandoned due to rising sea levels. Time is not on our side, he says, to transition away. So is there anything people can do to mitigate the coming crisis? It's not winter is coming, it's the flood is coming.
Yeah, I mean, that's hard, right? I mean, look, I'm in Devon. There's a storm warning tonight. There will be widespread flooding. There will be people who have to leave their homes. There will be they've shut off a lot of the trains. There are several train lines that are regularly flooded, and I just think surely the cost, every time there's a storm this happens, surely the cost of just building a line somewhere else that isn't on the shore, that just needs to happen, and it's not happening. And each time that they don't do it, it's a risk to human life, right? Because people are still trying to travel. Again, I think we just need to be honest about the fact that if we decarbonize tomorrow, magic solution, we've got fusion, right? Tomorrow we've got fusion, emissions are gone. Climate change will still continue to happen for some time because what we have put in the atmosphere is still in there. Unless we can find a way to draw it out, you know, kind of like how we dealt with the CFCs, it will still continue to warm. The planet will continue to heat. So we do need to think about mitigation, like increasing sea barriers. And they are doing this here in my hometown in Devon on the quayside, because there are pubs and houses along there. They're putting up barriers. But these are temporary measures. And we need to be honest about the fact that this will probably be a long-term change. And either those people need to be moved or compensated in somehow so that they can afford to move, if that's the case. Or we need to put up more barriers. We have a lot of the skill, a lot of the technology to do this. We're just not joining up the pieces yet. I mean, I've spoken to people who've just said, that where they live now, the insurance won't cover flooding because it's just so common. I mean, we shouldn't be we're still building in some of these zones, high risk of flooding. So there's a lot of these things that we do need to change. Again, I would just say that the people making the decisions don't necessarily, their focus is on 100 other things. Unless you bring it up to them, it's not even on their radar. So I'd encourage you to have those conversations with people who actually make policy on these issues. And sorry, I've lost the question.
No, that's fine.
Sure
It was
more fully.
What I think we're going to do, we've got 10 minutes. So I'm going to start steering. I'm going to take two questions that are not the same, but together, and you might be able to answer across them.
Okay, I will share my slides afterwards.
Oh yeah, to answer that one.
Okay.
So Anne Handley and John Cosham have two questions. So Anne's question I'll read out first, and then I'll read out John's. Anne says she understands that people in developing countries are not going to reduce their energy use at the rate that they can in developed countries, and neither should they. But in the West, using less energy in our homes by insulating them better and reducing holidays and flights and single persons car journeys will reduce carbon emissions. So surely these changes are worth encouraging and need government intervention.
Absolutely.
I can take John's as well. Hold on. And John says, so if taxation on specific high carbon items is not the answer, how do you like the idea of a carbon ration and everyone getting an annual allowance? Surely that would be fairer. So we've got what can governments do, and is this a good idea?
So actually, Anne, I'm really glad you raised this because there's more to say on this issue that I didn't cover, which is actually, so if you look now at some of the most developed countries, the most wealthy countries, we've got everything, we've got to a certain level. They are largely decoupling from emissions. And it is due to all those things I talked about, the innovation driving things, that the homes are being insulated, maybe not quickly enough, but people are doing it themselves. We are transitioning to EVs. There's a lot of things that are happening that are actually decoupling growth from emissions. So, and there's a good piece on that on Our World in Data that's worth looking into. So we should still encourage those because a lot of that, those changes are driven by us. I certainly don't mean to say that we shouldn't. I was more saying that most people already are, and on its own, it's not enough. And it can become a little bit that people think it's just about on its own because they end up hyper-focusing and feeling bad when we really need the broad-scale changes as well. And we're not very good at remembering that and pushing for those broad-scale changes. It might even be easy for me and you to try and live with less oil, but that's not going to make it happen on a broader scale. And that's where the funding and innovation needs to happen.
John was asking about rations instead of taxes on carbon.
Yes, I think that's a much fairer way. It doesn't have the negative connotations that tax has. I think there's a lot of good writing on this, a lot of good ideas that I support. Again, most people just aren't aware of these things. They don't tend to feature in the conversation. If there's a way to do it where it's fair and it's not going to penalize the people that suffer the most, then absolutely for it.
I'm going to take a slightly pessimistic or slightly dark picture question, and then we might move to some optimistic questions that give us something to say that's motivating and positive. So Simon Bull says, given your favourable view on nuclear power and the benefit of doubt on some of these issues, surely the lesson of history, nevertheless, is that no civilization has ever lasted more than 5,000 years. And if we were to keep nuclear waste being a civilization which will last for tens of thousands of years, what happens when future civilizations cease to be able to look after the waste? I mean, there's some interesting stuff on this. He doesn't fancy the future of a planet where tons of nuclear waste is no longer safely stored or maintained or looked after.
If we don't decarbonise as quickly as possible, if we don't decarbonise, I won't put a number on it because we don't know any numbers, definitely within 5,000 years it needs to happen. There will not be a planet. That is not an exaggeration. Please have a look at what the predictions are. If we go above 2-degree warming, this will not be a habitable planet for human life. The planet will continue. The planet will have a new climate. Maybe even that climate will settle itself eventually. We have to decarbonize. You don't have to like the solutions that we need to decarbonize, but I have covered in detail what the consensus is, the only way we know how to do it. Yes, there will be some waste, but the waste that we're storing in the Earth's atmosphere is already rendering our planet inhabitable for many species that are going extinct every day. And this will continue to happen until we make a choice to decarbonize, even if it is with technologies that we don't like. But in terms of the future, I feel I did answer this with what Finland's doing. Make a deep geological depository. It's 400 meters underground. It does not harm anybody. It's no different than naturally occurring uranium that's down there anyway, right? Nobody's being exposed to it. It's safely stored. Things can happen on the surface of the planet that will not impact that. It is absolutely safe. It has the consensus and support of the entire scientific community, what they're doing in Finland. And I urge you to look into it if you don't know about it, because we should all be doing that, really. That's the sanest way forward. And certainly it would mean that people wouldn't know or care it was there in 5,000 years.
Yeah, I went through a range of emotions to Simon's question. I think it's part of the problem. You're thinking about, to give 5,000 years, nothing that I know now will exist. It will be a world that's on the planet Earth.
But can I add something? It's separate. It's not about
Yeah.
nuclear, if I'm allowed, because I don't actually just want to talk about that.
No, I can move on.
But I appreciate people have questions. You know, I would hope that we would survive. You know, I would hope that we become a spacefaring civilization, that we move to other planets. I mean, the humans, Carl Sagan, great humanist, astrophysicist, said we're born as wanderers, we're wanderers still. He wrote in depth about how we would not be able to stay confined, just as we couldn't, you know, Columbus couldn't help going over there, but we didn't know if he'd fall off the edge of the map, but he had to go and explore. This is human nature. If we become a high energy society that also protects the planet and has a habitable planet to live on, there's no reason that we couldn't terraform other planets and make other beautiful environments for us to live in, and that would also solve any problems of resource use or space. But I do think it's in our human nature to do that. That's why we nobody really protests the space industry. How much money and resources goes into that, but we all understand really that this is incredible. When I learn something that is far away from this little pale blue dot that I live on, it's something for all of humanity. That knowledge and that picture looking back at the Earth that Apollo took that showed the little pale blue dot just in an ocean of black really helps bring us together as humanity. And I'd hope that is where we are in 5,000 years. I won't be here to know, but that is my optimistic view of the future, I'm afraid.
So we'll end with one last question from Councillor Rachel Dineley, who says, how do we make this a key issue in the next general election, given both MPs and the electorate as a whole are relatively ill-informed and often think it's just too difficult or too expensive to seek any resolution at all?
I mean, Liam, how political am I allowed to get?
You got to answer it very quickly and optimistically. That's my steer.
Optimistic. I mean, I am optimistic. I think current things that have just happened recently, not so great. But that's one individual, and even a lot of people in the party disagree with that decision around net zero, moving the goalposts or reducing the goals. I think talking about the issue, taking it forward, getting it put on the agenda, but in terms of solutions is what's going to make the difference. I think for too long, people like me have been battling on about this is what's wrong and this is what's bad, and people are sick of it, and it doesn't lead anyone towards solutions. I think actually the reason there if you go back a couple of years, there were debates, weren't they, going on between the two main parties that we're greener, no, we're greener, no, we're setting a target for 2050, no, ours is 2030. Do you remember that? That happened very quickly, and that was very positive. There might have been some steps back from there, but generally I think we're moving in the right direction. So just keep putting that pressure on, and don't underestimate the power of having these conversations, whether with politicians or ringing in on, when your local news, your local radio channel has a debate on it, make sure you get a voice in there. So you're not just hearing just stop oil or just stop our lifestyles. You're hearing start building clean energy, look at desalination for countries that, don't have access to clean water, think about energy poverty, and all of these things that I've covered in the talk and more. I think I am optimistic. I think it's hard to be optimistic on a narrow scale, but I ultimately think we will solve all of these problems, because historically we have done so with CFCs, the ozone layer, and many other things.
Now, the main presentation. There's nothing left to do tonight, with some ads at the end, but to formally present you, Zion, with the 2023 Holyoake Lecture Medal.
Thank you.
And I'll read the citation. For her contribution to our wider social and political discourse on environmentalism, and for her work to champion and publicise humanist climate action and evidence-based climate activism, Humanists UK is awarding Zion Lights the Holyoake Lecture Medal 2023. This is the point when, if this were a live event, there'd be rapturous applause, people would be crying and screaming. You can't hear them, but they are doing that. But just over 200 at the moment around the country.
Thank you very much.
Great. Congratulations again, Zion.